All right, what is up, everybody? Welcome back to another day of SaberSim's DFS Office Hours. It is Thursday, December 23rd of 2021 here. It is Christmas Eve, so to speak. We've got quite a little day of DFS here, a big NBA slate because there's no NBA tomorrow. Rare, big Thursday NBA slate. Of course, NFL Showdown, Niners and Titans tonight. Coming up on, of course, the holiday, but also a big weekend of DFS. If you're going to be playing DFS this weekend, football and basketball on both Saturday and Sunday. If this is your first time tuning in here, welcome. This is a live open Q&A show where I answer questions about SaberSim, about DFS, whatever you guys want to talk about. You guys drive the conversation via your questions that are asked in the Office Hours channel, in our Slack community, and also YouTube chat. So just a few questions in my queue here for today. Wasn't entirely sure how busy of a show we'd have here today. Hopefully folks have maybe the day off or are finally getting to be with friends and family heading into the holiday here. But as always, if you've got questions for me for today's stream, pop them into the YouTube chat, pop them into the Office Hours channel and Slack. I'll answer questions here in about the order that they come in. I've got two on my plate here for today. One about duplication here, duplicating with SaberSim users, I guess, in particular, and then another about sims and percentiles and the range of outcomes versus the percentiles. So we'll go ahead and get started here. Excuse me. I had some elite breakfast here right before I hopped on my stream here. I had a breakfast burrito. It was a little spicy, so my mouth is a little bit spicy. But let's go ahead. We'll get to this question here. This is from Jack. Good question here. Definitely one we can spend a bit of time on here. So Jack said, as SaberSim continues to onboard new users, does the value in using the defaults decrease due to the increase in people playing similarly? Essentially, at what point should we start thinking about getting different from other SaberSim users, not worried about getting duped, more worried about losing win equity with similar lineups around? This is an interesting question. I think there's kind of a lot of angles to take this. I think there's a lot to discuss here. I'm going to start by saying this. I think even over the next, I don't know, year or 2 years, I think the bigger value in terms of thinking about how you are going to differentiate is not coming from differentiating against SaberSim users, is more about differentiating against the field. Some of that is due to the way that SaberSim is just inherently designed, which I'll touch on in a second. But the other part is that if you were comparing the number of SaberSim users in particular that are in your contest, and even, I guess, narrowing down further, potentially maybe the number of SaberSim users that are just pressing build, making no changes, and just taking whatever comes out, is really just a drop in the bucket of all the people playing in the contest for most of the contests you're going to be playing. I think you don't add actually a lot of value by intentionally trying to differentiate from other SaberSim users specifically. That doesn't just provide way more significant value from differentiating against the field on the whole. And you can be more specific, I think, of taking that particular approach, right? The problem with, I think, saying that you're going to differentiate from SaberSim or from SaberSim users is that you end up probably butting heads directly with the model to accomplish that. Rather than changing the sliders, right? I think the easiest way to do that would be to kind of directly conflict the model. But let's break this question down like a little bit more. I think I want to talk about a few things, excuse me, that are unique to SaberSim that are going to prevent this. And maybe if you are interested in diversifying, if this is something that you've kind of decided to do, what the best ways to do it are. But this is really a problem no matter where you are, no matter what tool or content site or whatever you subscribe to, right? Is that theoretically other people using the tool, using the content are going to play in a somewhat similar strategy to you. I think SaberSim, because of the fact that we are using the game simulations and we are randomly bucketing game simulations, is going to diversify you from other SaberSim users more than almost any other site out there, significantly more than any other site out there. And your need to intentionally diversify is diminished significantly by the fact that we have the sim variance slider. And when you're playing GPPs, right, I mean, even just for basketball, lower variance sport, your sim bucketing is always going to generally be high enough here that your likelihood of duplicating other lineups is extremely low. And I know that maybe Jack's original question here says not worried about getting duped, more worried about losing win equity. I think that the main concern here from my perspective is the duplication, right? There's just not going to be enough SaberSim users in your contest, and your lineups aren't even going to come up similar enough that you have a significant risk of losing of your expected value of your lineups going down because you're losing equity. And you can kind of just test this out, right? Just running builds on like a reasonable high sim variance setting, running consecutive builds, you're going to see a general stance on the slate that is similar from build to build, which again, like maybe you are taking a similar direction. You might be overweight on similar players as other players in the field, but your chance of being duplicated is very low. And really the only thing that can have a dramatic impact on your win equity for the contest or on your expected value for the contest is that duplication. And the effort to avoid duplication, to have lineups with the higher expected value there, is just way better thought about and intentionally targeted as like a strategy when you're thinking about the field as a whole and not other SaberSim users. If you want to start differentiating, if you want to start being a little bit more unique, right? I think one of the easiest ways by far to do that while also not ruining your lineups or having to intentionally disagree significantly with the model is to bump up the sim variance slider, right? Allow more variability into your pool. Allow a smaller bucket of simulations to determine each individual lineup, and you are going to diversify pretty quickly. From there, right, especially speaking on some of the things that we were talking about yesterday, look at players that maybe you are getting in a lot of your lineups at the top that aren't necessarily players that are frequently optimal or aren't always showing up in your pool a lot, right? A very good way to kind of still operate within the constraints of what the model is really trying to do for a given slate would be to look at, who are the chalky plays, who are the must plays, someone like maybe Hernan Gomez, DeLon Wright, Jokic, right? See how some of these guys compare, right? We built this build at a higher variance than you'd be getting by default. See how often these guys are coming up optimal. See how much flexibility there is in the builder for a pool of 500 lineups, and maybe take some stands, right? But this is a little bit more strategic, right, of how you might be approaching a given slate. Right? You could even make this a significant stand if you wanted to. I don't think the way to go about this is to just start randomizing the sliders or making changes to the sliders to differentiate, because one, I think that's going to have a smaller impact on what lineups you end up rostering than you think. And two, you are very clearly sacrificing expected value doing that. Right? Beyond just increasing the variance slider, I think can be a good move. I think increasing the ownership fade slider can be a good move too. But just saying, I'm going to use these sliders tonight because they're going to be so different than what other people are going to be doing, I think you are going to make worse lineups and not diversify as much as you think. So I think you are better off using something a little bit closer to what the defaults are, increasing your variance to diversify the pool a bit more, and then taking stands on maybe plays that are just going to be popular in general is going to naturally diversify you against other SaberSim users as well. So, overall, again, I think that the biggest thing here is that diversification, both to get an edge on the field and a relative edge on the field from an ownership standpoint, but also to avoid duplication is important. I think you are better off thinking about that through the lens of diversifying against the entire field, the entire set of people in your contest, rather than the extreme minority of people that might be also using SaberSim to build their lineups, right? And I think you can do that if you want to diversify in a way that actually increases the upside of your lineups overall, rather than just trying to throw random elements into the process to know that you're doing something different, right? So I know it looks like we've got different Jack in chat. Jack, I'll get to your question in a second here, but Jack that asked this question in office hours. Not sure if you're watching me live here today. If you are, let me know. Let me know if you have any follow-up questions there. I think I did a pretty good job summarizing that, pulling that together. But I think it's an interesting question, and the main thing to remember there too is just that the approach to how SaberSim is building lineups is so far different than what else is out there that a lot of this is really taken care of for you. I'm curious. Before we move on, I'm curious about just running a little bit of an experiment and seeing if we happen to get the exact same lineup as the number one Saber score lineup in consecutive builds. So this was 3-3-8. Let's run another one at 3-3-8 and see what comes out of it. And it's possible, especially in a lower variance sport like basketball, it's possible that the top lineup is the same for both, right? But my gut feeling is that it will not be. But it's probably still in the pool. So actually a very different lineup here, right? So you can see we ran 2 consecutive builds, and this was with turning sim variance up a bit from the defaults. But we have 2 different lineups here. I wish I could actually just show these side by side, but you can see, right? This is the best overall lineup we could have created for this particular build, and this is the best lineup that we could create for this particular build. And are the exposures in general similar? Are we over on some similar players? Yeah, for the most part. But not necessarily. We're not necessarily taking the approach that we're playing the exact same set of lineups, first of all. And it's not even necessarily the same approach to the slate. So cool. Let's keep it going. I'm going to jump to this question. This is from Jack in Slack, different Jack in Slack. And Ben answered this question in the chat, but I'll cover this a little bit here. He said, can you explain percentages in actual Sims run for me, please? At 9:30 a.m. this morning, LeBron James' 85th percentile is 59.1 points, but when you look at the Sims, his 15th frequency is between 45 and 50 points. Can you help me understand? Thanks. Yeah, so these are basically referring to different things. So we'll start with the percentile. So the 85th percentile is basically the point value that the player in all of the Sims reaches or exceeds 15% of the time, right? So we'll use Jokic as the example here, right? So Jokic, in all of the simulations we have for his game, reaches or exceeds 68.5 DraftKings points 15% of the time. When we look at his range of outcomes, right, this particular block says percentage of Sims 15%. He's scoring let's see, 55 to 60, 57 to 60 fantasy points in 15% of Sims, right? So it's like the same percentage, but the 85th percentile is referring basically to all of the outcomes here that add up to 15%, right? So you can kind of see it. His 85th percentile is right about here, 68.5, right? Where the sum of all of the outcomes greater than that add up to 15%. So they're basically referring to different things. When you hover one of these bars, it's showing you within that bar, right? Within that fantasy point bar, which again, I know is a little bit hard to see, that outcome happens 15% of the time. In this bar, it's 14% of the time, right? So they're basically referring to different things. But the easiest way to think about the percentiles, I think, or at least probabilistically speaking, and like for the purposes of what you might do, what you might use these for your actual research, is thinking about, right, the player meets or exceeds that fantasy point total 100 minus the percentile percent of the time, right? So 15% of the time, 5% of the time he meets or exceeds 75 points. You can do it in reverse too, right? Jokic's final score is 68.5 or less 85% of the time. So, but good question there. Cody said Ben explained it really well too. Yeah, I always get a little self-conscious whenever somebody jumps in and answers one of these questions ahead of time. I always want to avoid coming on here and then creating confusion where somebody else has already answered it well. So I do think Ben did a good job explaining that in the chat. But let's keep it going here. We'll hit some of these questions that have come in chat. Jack said, hi, Jordan. For the last week in NBA and NFL, all my low projected scores have done well in a large field GPP, and my high projected scores have not cashed. Is that because the lower projected scores tend to have the highest upside? Not necessarily. I mean, I do think it is probably true that if you're building a pool of lineups, let's say you're building 20 lineups, right? And you have one lineup that's projected to score 150 and another lineup is projected to score 120, but both lineups have a similar Saber score. Like, we are essentially saying that that 120 point lineup, while having probably a lower average performance, having lower min cash and lower maybe triple up equity, right? It does have a higher raw upside, right? If the expected value of those two lineups are similar and one lineup is a lower projected score, what is essentially being the point being made by Saber score in that sense is essentially saying that that lower projected lineup has a lot higher, maybe top 1% equity or top 0.1% equity. Otherwise, the expected value wouldn't be equivalent. But I mean, the simpler answer here, and I think what's probably true in this particular case, maybe not so much necessarily for NBA, but especially for NFL, right? It hasn't been, at least for a couple weeks here, slates where the cash has really done well, or the chalk has really done well. Like last week in particular was, I think, like a chalk nightmare, right? And when chalk underperforms, lower scoring lineups are going to succeed more. Less chalky lineups, more contrarian lineups, and lineups that in general are probably projected for less on average are going to outperform, because all of those top projected plays that are taking up a lot of ownership and are highly projected all failed. So I think that explains a lot. But no, I mean, in general, though, in a very general sense, right? If you have two lineups with a similar Saber score, which is essentially an attempt to quantify expected value, is what we're doing, where it's an approximation of expected value, and one lineup's average projection is much higher than the other, it probably means that the lower projected lineup has a lot higher top 1% or top 0.1% equity in the contest, has a much higher chance of realizing that, because that's where its expected value is coming from. You have one lineup that maybe finds itself into the top 5% of the contest 8% of the time or something like that, and it creates a lot of its positive expected value through that equity. But you have another lineup that scores in the top 0.1%, 0.25% of the time, right? And all of its expected value is coming from that extreme upside condition, right? That can also be why you're seeing this. But in terms of why, in the last couple of weeks, the lower projected lineups are outperforming, I think it's been a situation where chalk has failed, especially in NFL. And NBA is a bit of a dumpster fire right now anyway, right? I don't think we've really had many slates recently where the chalk is just performing to expectation. I mean, there's been times where, with all the COVID stuff going on, the chalk like barely even plays, right? Or there's just a ton of variance. There's a ton of unpredictability in who's going to play and who's going to get minutes and who's going to get usage, and how all of these guys that we have very little data on, period, and much less data on playing together are playing basketball together. So, yeah. But Mitchell said, does not having enough hammer game players affect my EV? I assume you're talking about late game hammers, right? In fact, having players from the late games does not affect your EV whatsoever. The time that the games start has no impact on how a player is projected or the expected value of a lineup. The way it feels as a person when you are watching the contest, especially if you are up early in the slate and then you have people chasing you down with the late games later, it certainly feels like it is negative EV to do that. And it certainly feels bad when you are maybe up 10x after the first 3 rounds of games are over, and then you end up falling down and maybe just breaking even on the night. But in reality, the NBA could come out right now and basically say that or an hour before lock, they could come out and say, we're mixing up all the start times of the games. Now all the games start at different times. And that would not change the projections whatsoever. So it does not change the expected value of the lineups at all. I think the only exception where this can actually have an impact on your expected value of your lineups is if there is a late swap situation where it is like strategically optimal to get exposure to the late game because there are players that maybe could present significant value if they were ruled out, right? And I don't even know if we really have a situation like that in any of the late games tonight. But let's say LeBron was questionable instead of probable, and let's say in particular maybe this was a very thin value slate, which it's not. There are no thin value slates right now. There's almost too much value actually most of the time right now. But if it were the case that maybe the top overall projected play was 5.5x or something like that, or even 6x, and there just wasn't a lot of value, and LeBron was legitimately questionable, there at that point could be an argument to be made that at lock, creating flexibility so that you could swap to the best plays in this game, hypothetically, if LeBron were to be ruled out, then that might be strategically optimal. It might be more plus EV to have players from the late game in there. But that is because of late swap flexibility and not because of the raw start time of the game. So there is very, very, very little reason on almost any slate, I think, to intentionally target a specific time of a game rather than a game situation or players in the game or something like that. So, but good question. Chris said, is there any merit in trying to use a betting slate to inform your builds and taking stands that way? I think it can be interesting. It's not something that I've done too much of. I think in particular, as with a lot of these things, right? I think the information that you gain from going in there is probably most useful as a tool to see maybe how the public is thinking about a game situation rather than necessarily trying to make a prediction on or a better prediction on the game outcome, right? If you are seeing that a line on a game or something like that has moved significantly throughout the day or throughout the week, and you are not seeing, let's say like the implied team total, or let's just use the game total. Let's say that the implied game total of Denver and Charlotte, which it looks like is probably going to be one of the highest totals on the slate for tonight, sinks throughout the day, right? And comes down. I think the more interesting tool for using that, rather than thinking I'm going to fade this game, I think I would be more interested in thinking, okay, I think the public actually may fade this game more than maybe the ownership projections at the moment indicate. And actually, we don't even maybe seem to think that this game is going to be too chalky. I do, but maybe the pricing doesn't work here too well. But I think that's the most interesting way that I would use it, is keeping track of pretty significant line movements. And use it as a tool mostly to study what the field is going to do or how the field might react to that, or an indication that, especially if there's a discrepancy between ownership projections and the way what is implied by the way a line has moved, I think is pretty interesting. I would only do this for big major markets, right? Because in some ways what you're doing here is you're saying that you're going to trust Vegas, that Vegas is an arbiter of truth. I would be cautious. I guess what I'm saying is I would be cautious of watching like player prop line movement, because those props are somewhat beatable themselves. So I think especially studying like closing lines and where the line has moved to from where it started at the beginning of the day in sides, spreads and totals and things like that can definitely be interesting. Trying to think if there's anything else that I have to say on this one. The one other point of caution that I would exercise, and one way I've seen this done in a way that I don't think is effective before, is trying to predict blowouts. I think in an effort of looking for games that maybe have a very close spread at close or something like that, or trying to avoid studs in games that have a wide spread at close, right? I think you are probably going to make yourself play a little bit closer to what the field is likely to do anyway, and not actually increase the accuracy or the probability of your lineups having success anyway, right? Like saying, I don't know. Let's pick a game here, right? Maybe Phoenix. Well, this probably already has a big spread, but I don't know. Maybe you pick a game on the slate and you say, I've watched the way that this line has moved throughout the day. Phoenix started with, I don't even know what they are. Maybe they're an 11.5 point favorite, and now they're a 13.5, 14.5 point favorite by the end of the day. I'm going to remove all exposure to Phoenix Suns stars and play Thunder scrubs or something like that to predict a blowout. I think if you are going to go and predict the blowout anyway, you might as well just go and bet the line itself, right? There's enough variance in the actual individual game outcome that I think thinking about it that way is going to hurt you more than help you. But that's at least kind of my gut reaction. I think this is a good question. Again, it's not something that I use necessarily a ton beyond trying to study what the field is going to do. And I know back when it was baseball season, I did like to use this Vegas dashboard that Fantasy Labs has set up. Do they have any information up here? Like even from, I guess they probably have one for NBA too. So I have before used this as just like a checking where the implied live lines are as a way to get an idea, especially in baseball, of where the chalk is going to be. Like I think if you're looking at a baseball slate and you're struggling to figure out what's the chalky stack and what's the chalky pitcher, I used this all the time of just going in here and just seeing who is the highest expected team total and who's the lowest, and just identifying chalk that way. So when I look at this kind of thing, most of the time I overall am more interested in figuring out what is the field going to do, rather than trying to figure out what am I going to do as a result of that. So, but Chris said, I hope that question made sense. It made sense to me. Hopefully my answer made sense. If I tackled that question in a way that wasn't exactly what you were asking for, let me know. But so Tamaka said same in hockey. Yeah, I think actually there's so many things that transfer well between hockey and baseball DFS, but yes, you can probably very easily do a similar thing. Actually, there's no lines, right? No hockey right now. So, but yes, who are the chalky lines? Who's the chalky goalies? Take the current implied team totals of every team on the slate and study it that way. Yeah, it's a good question. I think that's about all I have to say on that. But Snyder's here. Said, "What's up, Jordan? Love these shows." Thanks, man. Thanks for being here. Let me know if you have any questions for me. And I'm looking at it here, and that was the last question I had in my queue. That's all we had. So we're only about 25 minutes in, 27 minutes in. Any other questions for me here today? Anything else? Fire away if you've got them. This is our last show of the week. Christmas Eve tomorrow. I'll be down at my folks' house. So no DFS really to play tomorrow either. So a good day to take off. Have a lot of DFS going on Christmas Day. Obviously, the 5-game NBA slate, which is always a really fun one if you can manage to get away in late swap. But 2 football games too. The NFL and NBA directly competing for viewership on Saturday. Joshua said, "I'm really torn about adding my own exposures and predictions versus letting SaberSim do that for me." I would go for it. Joshua said, "I feel like when I do not do my own touch-ups, then the lineups are average, but I also don't want to take away from the point of SaberSim." Yeah, you really aren't. You really are not. Especially if you are operating within your pool of lineups, right? Like the main thing to remember here is the sims are not going anywhere. I think maybe that's the crucial point. No matter what, whether you're adjusting projections, now you can make extreme projection adjustments that maybe really change the way that the sim looks, right? But the sims aren't going anywhere. If you change projections, right, and you change Jokic down a few points, what am I doing? 54.67, right? You change Jokic down, right? Maybe you say Maybe you're like Chris and you're tilting Jokic from last night, right? So you say, I'm knocking Jokic down a bit, right? All we're doing is we're shifting the distribution of the sims a little bit down. So when we go in and we like query the sims to build all of your lineups, we're still using the range of outcomes of Jokic. Things have been shifted a little bit to the right. They've been all shifted -3 fantasy points to the right, but you're still going to get Jokic upside games showing up in your lineups. Right. And even better, if you're working from the pool of lineups that we build for you, right, and you haven't touched projections at all, you're just sorting between lineups that we all think are viable for the contest. So I really would not feel like you are going to break something by making adjustments here. I think it's important to feel at least a little bit confident in your ability to add value to the process at different stages here. And I think like even in step 3, when you're mostly sorting through the pool of lineups that we've already built for you, right? Like I think it's even fine to let a little bit of your gut feel play a role here, right? Because the lineups already exist. The lineups have been built. They are optimized for the sims as they were with no changes to projection. And we've given you the best 500, right? So when you're going through and selecting for the best 20, right? I think it's okay to make some calls, right? And that's part of the fun of it too. That's part of like, with a traditional tool, you can't really afford to do that because it's so easy to break or to make bad lineups, right? In fact, there are so many landmines in a traditional optimizer of the settings that need to be set the exact way to build lineups for upside. All of these lineups have upside because they've been built with an eye towards the real range of outcomes of players, with ownership towards correlation, right? And we're selecting the best 20 here. So, I mean, if you're coming at it from the standpoint of saying, I don't want to play Jokic because he had a bad night last night, I think that's fine, right? If you're coming at it from the standpoint of saying, I don't want to play Hernan Gomez at 43%, right? Because of a game theory angle, I think that's fine. I think if you say, I want to make sure I'm 3x the field on Sabonis because I think he's going to be relatively low given his upside, and I don't think that Christian Wood can stop him, right? All we are doing is we're sorting through lineups that we already think are viable. And it's more fun this way too. Like that's like a legitimate factor here. There are certain slates where you're going to build lineups with SaberSim. You're going to look at the lineups. You're going to be like, that looks pretty good, right? I'm fine with that. But I do think it's a little bit more fun. If you've got a stand that you want to take on a player, right? Go for it. Because the lineups that we've built for you are already viable here. And if you get to the point where you've made so many changes, the message comes up and says, we don't have enough lineups in the pool to do what you're trying to do, then maybe at that point, take a step back and ask yourself, where are these takes coming from? Are these data driven? Can I back these up? The reasons that I want to, if I was explaining to somebody why I'm taking a 100% fade on Hernan Gomez, could I explain to somebody why I was doing that? Right. And if you couldn't, then maybe you put him back in and maybe find a different stand to take, or maybe regress a little bit more to the mean. And this is true. I know I talk about exposures I know I talk about exposures a lot, and I talk about how editing exposures is a little bit of a safer way of adding your value. And it is, but I don't want to send the message that you can never touch any of the projections here on step 1, because you can too, right? Like you are, especially if you use a lighter touch and you work with anywhere between 5 and 15% changes to certain players, right? Maybe use a 10% bumps and drops, right? You are not going to break anything here. You really are not, right? There's enough variance in the projection itself that what you could potentially break here is pretty small. Unless you're really going crazy. Like if you told me that you were dropping Jokic's average projection to 28 points, right? You have essentially unchecked him at that point. I would probably not agree that Jokic's real mean outcome is 28% or 28 fantasy points, right? I mean, we can just look at this. This is a low variance sport. This is an easily projectable sport, right? And Jokic's most common range of outcomes, right? Basically, if we're saying his average is 57 to 67, his outcomes that are between 52 roughly and maybe 65 and roughly 62 fantasy points, right? Like the plus or minus 5 fantasy points on either side only actually adds up to 43. Wait, what? 40? No, yeah, like 43% of the time, right? So if you told me that you actually thought that this is a little bit high, or you just wanted to be under on him and you made an adjustment to bring him down to even something like 52, right? Like the impact of what's actually happening here, you are not breaking anything by doing this. And you, in fact, are probably adding more value than you think if you are at least targeting a few specific players where maybe the situation is murky, or you stand to gain a lot from a game theory standpoint, or you stand to gain a lot just from purely diversifying. Nobody else is going to do it in the same way you are. That I think it adds a lot of value. So especially once you feel like you are very familiar with the basic SaberSim process, right? You have a sense of what the sims are. You have a sense of what the sliders are doing, how they work, how the lineups get built, right? Like the overall what's actually happening here when you build your lineups. I think it is a really, really, I think it can add a lot of value quickly to start leaving a little bit of your own mark on the process, because there are things that the model isn't going to be able to pick up on its own. The way you are going to do your particular process is going to be unlike the way anybody else goes about doing it, which is going to naturally diversify you, right? And it is in some ways, not all the ways, but in a lot of ways, SaberSim is kind of anti-fragile, where it is difficult to break something, right? And I think some of that's mindset, right? If you told me that, let's say you came in here and you were like, you know what, I'm taking a stand here, and I think that projection feels a little bit high. Maybe you don't think that Denver is going to match up well against Charlotte, or you read, I don't know. There's just so many different things out there. Maybe you think the ownership is going to come in higher than it is, right? And at the end of the slate, Jokic goes off for 78 DK points at 45% ownership, and you get crushed, right? That does not mean that you broke it. That does not mean that you broke SaberSim or did something wrong, right? In fact, you probably had a pretty high expected value lineups there if that ownership did come in as high as it did, and if Jokic's real mean value for his outcomes tonight was actually 52.5 points, right? So it is easy to get in the false mindset of, if I do the exact right thing tonight and put everything exactly at the right point, I'm going to win everything. And then tomorrow, when you don't win everything, it means you didn't put the exact right thing in all the right spots. And that's not really how it works, right? So ultimately, really, let's say you're a perfectly average player, right? Totally average. You place 1% of your lineups in the top 1% of every contest you play on average. And you start changing your process and start making changes, and you are adding some value by adjusting exposures or maybe projections or research or whatever it looks like, right? I think the best case scenario, like literally the best, you move from perfectly average to elite, is you start putting 2% of your lineups into the top 1%. And that's probably the absolute best scenario. So the idea that you're going to figure out the exact steps on any given night, set the settings exactly where they're supposed to optimally be, and then just win, right? That's not actually how it works. So, but anyway, wrap this one up. Got excited about this particular question here. I see there's other questions that have come in now as well. So we'll move on here. But let's see. Joshua said, I feel like when I do not, I read this already. Yeah. So Jack said, how can I spot high ceiling / upside NBA players on SaberSim? I think we talked about this yesterday, Jack, right? Didn't we have a similar question yesterday? Or I'm just having crazy deja vu. I remember talking about looking at percentiles to just look at like raw upside as a way. Another way you can do it is to look at run what I like to call research builds at 0, 0, 10 sliders, and then see how often certain players are showing up in optimal lineups for random sets of game sims. And then I think the final way is to actually just run builds on default settings and just see who the who, when taking into account correlation and ownership fade and sim variance into account, who are the players that are popping. But I swear, I think I covered this in. Let me look. I think I covered this in quite a bit more detail recently. In one of these, maybe it was yesterday's. Let me look. Or maybe the day before. Let's look at the day before, because I remember this question coming in. But well, now I can't find it. Maybe it was the day before. And if I can't find it, then maybe we'll just answer it anyway. Oh, here it is. Okay. So it was Monday's stream. Yeah, Mondays. At the 51:17 minute mark, answered this question a little bit more in detail. So Cody said, thanks for running these shows daily, Jordan. Hope you have a good Christmas and best of luck to everybody on the DFS slates coming up. You as well, Cody. Thank you for being a part of the audience here every day. So Ryan says, Jokic was projected 20 points ahead of SGA, which is why he was so highly owned at captain/MVP slot. SGA hit his 99th percentile, so would have been optimal even if Jokic had a normal game. Yeah, there's a lot of variability here, even on a lower variance sport, right? So you can just see it. I mean, just looking at what the ranges of outcomes of players look like for yourself and kind of trying to internalize, like, what do these numbers mean, right? You know, Jokic's 25th percentile outcome. Well, actually, he looks like a pretty good play based on the percentiles. Like, he really grades out well. But, I mean, still, there's 25% of the outcomes where Jokic doesn't even hit 50 points, right? People are going to be disappointed if Jokic fails to hit 50 points. And that happens one out of 4 times. And that's just one player. You're picking 8 players to build a lineup. So, Chris said, conventional wisdom says Jokic's ownership will be down, but I think DFSers understand variance enough to confidently go right back tonight. I think this is actually a really good point. I think you're right. I think box score watching is dead. It used to be that you could chase, no one would chase a player that just let them down. Like, no one would. And I think it's dead. I think it's indicative of how many people are using at least some basic set of projections and building their lineups, because it doesn't work that way anymore. You don't get the people that are like, Jokic killed me last night. Jokic had a down game. I'm not going to play him tonight. And you get him at no ownership. I think he's going to be just as chalky tonight, especially in the, because projection systems are going to love him again, right? He's carrying a ton of usage. His rates of rebounding, assists, of scoring are just ridiculous. He's having like one of the most efficient seasons of all time, playing in a game with a 230-point total, roughly. Projection systems are going to love Jokic again. And I would not be surprised to see him as being incredibly chalky, right? I actually think we have this just like we'll see how everything breaks out. I could be wrong here. We'll see how it breaks out throughout the day. But I think there's a very interesting just like pivot opportunity tonight where you have 3 of the highest projected players on the slate are all center/util positions. They're, in particular, Jokic and Embiid are almost the exact same salary, but Towns is here too, right? Like, no one, I have a hard time seeing how anybody's going to play. I mean, Embiid, I think, will get some ownership. Maybe I have a hard time seeing how people are going to get to these guys, though, really. Especially if also the best value plays on the slate are like Boogie and Hernan Gomez, right? I don't know. I mean, multi-positional flexibility kind of allows you to build unique lineups. You can play a Hernan Gomez plus Jokic lineup, or you could play like Boogie and I guess even Embiid together. But I think we have this just like, I would not be surprised to see, even if it's not exactly this ownership, and there's still a lot of time left before the slate, I would not be surprised to see something like this, where you have Jokic overwhelmingly the most chalky pay-up option and much less ownership on Embiid and Towns, just because of the way the positional eligibility works. So, and like even just a couple years ago, I think you would have the exact opposite, where like Embiid crushed the last time he played and Jokic failed last night. And I think this would have been flipped, even if the projections were the same, just because so many more people were hand building just a couple years ago. So Cody said, the idea is if you change stuff and you're wrong, you can completely mess up the slate. But if you do it in step 3, you can only get what was already good. Yeah, so I think that's mostly true. And if you're looking for a place to start your process, like you want to begin adding more value to SaberSim and leaving your mark on it, start that with step 3, because you're working from a set of lineups that we already think have win equity, have high expected value, right? Are good lineups, and you are selecting for different lineups out of that bigger set. So it's much less fragile. It's much easier to do that without breaking something. In step 1, you are setting the foundation for how the lineups are going to be built. So your risk is higher, right? Like if let's say you're fading Jokic tonight, right? So in option 1 is you build your lineups, you don't touch anything, you go to step 3 and you uncheck Jokic. And what the builder is going to do is going to say, okay, this guy doesn't want to play Jokic. Let's give him the best 20 lineups where Jokic isn't in the lineups. Right. And those lineups already existed, even knowing that Jokic was an option. If you remove in step 1, we're going to build 500 or 1,500 lineups that have no Jokic in them. Right. Now, for one player, that probably doesn't make a huge difference how you go about doing that. But let's say you're also going in and adjusting exposures, and maybe you're also going in and locking players in and removing other players from the slate, right? Like everything you do in step 1, SaberSim is just going to say, okay, great, we'll do it. Everything you do in step 3, there's at least the moment of like that message coming up on screen and saying, we can't support this. You've gone too far, really. So, but Joshua says another question. For example, Trae Young. Everyone knows he is almost guaranteed for 40 to 50 points a night, maybe. Or at least I feel comfy expecting that. But SaberSim rarely uses him or other players kind of like that. Is it because their cost is not worth their production? Do we have the Hawks on the slate? Isn't Trae Young's in protocols, right? I don't think he's on the slate tonight. Yeah, I mean, I guess you can kind of say like something similar to Steph Curry, right? He's like one of our lower projected players on the slate. I think one thing, especially in basketball with some of these guys that get a lot of their production through scoring, like scoring actual real life basketball points, it's easy for their salaries to get a little bit out of whack because their top end ceiling is like, I mean, what's Curry's top end ceiling? It's like probably like 50 real life points and like maybe 10 assists or something like that. Like similar guy like Trae Young, right? Like they have a little bit of that assist potential, but their top end ceiling is they're a little bit more volatile players because they score mostly through actually scoring. And they end up getting priced, especially if they've recently had that ceiling game. They kind of get priced to their ceilings a little bit more than I think guys that have a little bit more maybe reliable fantasy point scoring. Like you said, Trae Young's guaranteed 40 to 50 points a night. I don't know what Trae Young was most recently priced at. I don't know if I would agree that he's guaranteed to 40 to 50 points a night. And even if he was, that wouldn't necessarily be enough to roster him, right? Like you look at a guy like Curry, he's basically priced at his ceiling right now. And yeah, I guess essentially with this outcome curve, like we are saying that roughly 50%, a little under 50% of his game outcomes are between 40 and 50 points. But even if you got those game outcomes, you probably wouldn't even put him in the lineup. So, but it's not very easy ever for me to go in and sometimes I get questions where people are like, explain this projection. And that's not a very easy question to answer beyond making sure that they have an understanding of how the sims work and how the projections are actually literally generated, how they're actually calculated. But that's kind of my best guess for, in general, why you might see that some of these like pure scorer types. And I know someone probably out there is like clawing their eyes out that I'm calling Curry. I probably have some Warriors fan in the audience that's upset that I'm calling Curry a pure scorer. But I think that's kind of the idea there. So. But Josh said today is almost unplayable with all this news every day. Go light. Yeah, it depends on the way you cut it. I've been enjoying these slates because I think the more news, the bigger the edge. But if you're the type to go and like, if your approach is studying every game on the slate and kind of looking at matchups and things like that, or it's got to be brutal how often you have to go back and kind of rethink and redo everything. But Chris said, that's mainly why I fade the high price guys. Raw points matter, but it's still disappointing if 12K only gets you about 45 points, while some 5K player can do the same and often does. Yeah, it goes both ways. 12K, 45 points is not going to get you there. That's not enough. But there are actually very few players on a slate that legitimately have 70-point upside, like that actually have that, or even 60-point upside that actually have that in like their realistic range of outcomes. And I think that's what you get out of some of those most expensive players is like, it's an opportunity cost thing, right? You can only put 8 guys in a lineup. So if you can get 70 out of a player, you almost have to have him, even if 70 points is only 5.5x for like a super expensive player, right? That's why it's so valuable. So that's also why thinking about target scores purely from salary times a multiplier doesn't work, because 5x or 6x isn't the same for every player in the pool. A 5K player going 6x is 30 points. Great. Okay, that's good. But a 12K player going 6x is 60 points. And there's probably just very few players in the overall pool that are even going to score 60 points on a given night. So having one of them in your lineup and having the opportunity to get more points from 7 other players provides so much value. So I think it goes both ways. But obviously, your downside of spending that much salary on one player is also a lot higher. So. But Chris said I should say like to be underweight relative to the field. Maybe fade means the same thing. Yeah, and I think like, again, talking about this a little more is like you could take this a step further and say, do Jokic and Embiid really have really spectacularly different ceilings tonight? I mean, we're getting, like, according to this, the 95th percentile between Jokic and Embiid is about an 8-point difference, and maybe that is significant, but like, from my perspective, the true ceilings of these two players is probably actually pretty similar, right? And if this is, or let me put it this way, even if the true ceiling difference between these two players is 8 points, that Jokic has a 8-point higher 95th percentile than Joel Embiid, right? The discrepancy between what we think their ownership is going to be at the moment is so much higher that you get a ton of relative edge rostering Embiid more than Jokic. You can't fade all of these guys unless you just want to play perfectly balanced lineups, which maybe is your approach. I think you got to spend your money somewhere. But Tamaka said, how much would you alter projections before it can cause issues? Say, for example, I think a player will get 1.5x the minutes SaberSim projects. Can I just 1.5x their point projection? Okay. It's an interesting question. So I think it depends a lot on what you are trying to accomplish. If you think there is something wrong with the minutes projection, right? What I would do is I think it's probably fine to say that a player's minutes projection is 1.5 times off, but you should also then look at that team and make sure that the minutes add up, that you haven't just created minutes out of nowhere, because something has to give for minutes to be wrong, right? If you are just looking more to like give bumps on certain players, maybe because you want to get a little bit more exposure to a guy, or you think that there's a little bit more upside that a player has than we project, or just from a game theory standpoint, you want to be over the field on somebody, I like to start with just 10% bumps. And in that case, I'm a little less concerned about, like, if I went in here and said, I want to play a game theory angle, right, on these two centers, and I want to just even these two projections out, like, I'm going to build lineups like this. In this case, I'm a little bit less concerned with going in and saying, okay, now I have to figure out where the 3 points that I gave to Joel Embiid came from. But if we're looking at a team that has a bunch of injury issues, let's go to Charlotte. And let's say we're looking at Charlotte and we say, okay, I think these, oh wait, no, that's not what I wanted to do. I wanted New Orleans. I'm looking for Hernan Gomez. Who he play for? New Orleans now. That's what it is. Let's say you were looking at like the best projected plays and you thought that this minutes projection looked a little bit high for Hernan Gomez or something like that, right? Maybe there's going to be a little bit more diversity at center, right? If you're going to say that I actually think Hernan Gomez is going to play 20 minutes, right? I'm going to take 80% of this projection, which is, let's just do it since we're doing it now, right? So maybe I'm going to drop Hernan Gomez down to 26, right? In this case, since you're doing this more from like a standpoint of making the projections more accurate, right? I would make sure that those minutes go back somewhere. So we dropped him, and you could just do this just by projection. So we dropped him by 7.5 points. So maybe you give 3 points to Herbert Jones, right? And another 3 points to Jackson Hayes or something like that, right? I think that's fine. So it kind of depends on what you're going for, right? Does that make sense? Like if you're reassigning minutes, you think minutes projections are off, those minutes have to come somewhere. They have to add up. I think it makes sense to kind of make equal adjustments on different players and different teams, right? But if you're coming at this from the standpoint of trying to like play a game theory angle or trying to make bumps on players that just kind of you have a sense that their projection is off, I think then it makes sense. Then I wouldn't worry so much about making sure everything evens out. But if you're looking for, in general, like what's a good starting point to adjust projections for, I would start with 10%. Start with 10% bumps or drops and run builds and see what happens, right? Like it's possible, depending on how the slate fits all together, that you could drop Jokic's projection by 10% and you go from 100% Jokic to 0% Jokic. And maybe that's not the approach you really wanted. So maybe you end up doing a 5% drop. At the same time, depending on the right slate, you could drop a player 10% and their exposure in your lineups doesn't move at all. So but all right, let's see. Let's keep it going. Joshua said, how can I pick and choose particular lineups in step 3 and just use those to fill my entries? What I would do is go to a lineup build, turn your lineups to 0, right? Oh, maybe not 0, maybe 1. Set your lineups to 1, and then you can just uncheck this one. And then I've done this before. I do this when I'm only playing, like typically when I'm playing 5 or less lineups, I like to choose lineups this way. I'll just click no here for now. And then what I actually like to do is I'll just close this completely and I go to my pool and you can check in your lineups just from here. So maybe you want this one. Maybe you're playing 5 lineups and you want this one and you want this one and you want this one. And then you go way down here and you go get this one. And now you have a pool of lineups that you basically handpicked for yourself. And maybe these are your single entries, right? So you could go in here and maybe you name these. These are my single entry lineups that I'm playing tonight. And I'm going to unique fill those into my single entries. So Don said, are you negating the quality of selections of SaberSim if we alter projections, which would typically be done in step 1? Are you altering the quality of selections? It depends. It depends on the value that you're adding by making that move, right? So that's kind of why I say, like, ask yourself how confident you are in that change. And the more you can argue why you're adjusting a player, the more maybe you've done some research and you think that a team's going to play smaller because of the matchup that they have, right? And you have this general sense of confidence and you're making adjustments in step 1, right? Maybe you know that that's adding value, or you have a strong sense that that's adding value, so you're doing it in step 1. I mean, you can definitely do things that are unwise and make your lineups worse in step 1. You absolutely can, right? This is an extreme example. This is hyperbole, but this, or actually, you know what? Let's do this. This probably makes your lineups worse, right? So I think if you said, okay, but Jordan, I want to play a lot of Towns and not play Jokic, right? I would probably go about doing that in step 3, because you're working from a pool of lineups that we already think is viable. Right? So again, I think like the theme here is changes you make in step 1 are generally going to be riskier. Changes in step 3 are going to be a little bit more safer, but you also, like, you can have a little bit more impact by making adjustments on step 1. And you're going to create a better pool of lineups for what you are trying to do by making adjustments in step one. So, like I've mentioned before, let's say you had a ton of changes you wanted to make on this slate, right? You had a lot of different, you wanted to get a lot of leverage on certain players. You wanted to fade other players, right? If you were making all of those changes in step 3 for a 500 lineup build, sometimes you are just left by process of elimination with the last 20 lineups that are remaining, rather than the best 20 lineups from the pool. Making those adjustments in step 1 allows you to do a better job of selecting for the best 20 in step 3. But it's riskier because you've changed the way that the build is working. So I know that's a little bit confusing. I know because the problem is I don't want to give the indication to anybody that you can't make changes in step 1 or that you should only do it in step 3. But I do think it is safer in general to do things in step 3 because the pool of lineups already exists. So Don said, I didn't think of it that way. That helps a lot. Good. Okay. I'm glad. I was worried that sounded like I was kind of like rambling here. I think there's a place for both, honestly. And right now, I mean, just to be completely transparent, like something I'm trying to incorporate more into my process, making some adjustments to step 1, because I've been editing exposures for years and doing that pretty successfully. But like, I like the idea of, I think the perfect SaberSim process would be making some adjustments to step 1 to set a foundation for how you want to tackle the slate, and using step 3 to quality control and optimize and dial things in. I think that's the optimal usage. But there's a spectrum there of different play styles. It does not necessarily mean that everybody plays that way. And it doesn't necessarily mean that everybody's strength is the same thing. There's going to be people that have a very intuitive sense of looking at NBA projections and dialing things in here on step 1. And there's going to be other players that have a very good sense of what the right leverage is to get on certain players in step 3. So anyway, I'm going to move on because I don't want to create any more confusion here. So Cody said, I think the opposite. People don't handle new info well, gives more edge. I assume this was about the NBA thing. Yeah, I agree with you. I think it does. I think it does create a lot of edge. So Andrew says, can we edit exposures after filtering in step 3? If not, this would be a very cool feature. You can't right now, but it is coming. So we do want to add that. I would think it would be pretty cool too. So like you could, for example, say like, filter by, I don't know, filter by Jokic lineups and reduce my exposure to those lineups where I also have Cam Reddish, right? So you could say like, these are 2 chalky players. You have a pay up option and a value option that complement each other in the lineups because they don't occupy the same positions. I think they're going to be popularly used together. And while I want exposure to both, I don't want them together. So when Jokic is in the lineup, don't include more than 10% Cam Reddish or something like that. That's something we want to add. So, but awesome. That last half hour just absolutely flew by. We really kind of ripped off the entire last half hour of the show today. I do have to cut it off there. That is, oh gosh. Man, that is the last question I'm going to be able to answer on stream here. I do see a really long question that was just posted by Pinseeker in the Office Hours chat. Pinseeker, we're right up against the end of the show here today. And this question is going to take me a little bit of time to process through. So I will give this a read here this afternoon and write you a response and get back to you there. But I think I will have to, there's a bit too much going on here on screen for me to give you a fair answer right here live. So that is going to do it for today. Guys, have a Merry Christmas. Have a great weekend. Hopefully spend some time with the people who are important to you in your life over this weekend here. Maybe get a chance to unwind and relax a little bit. I know sometimes the holidays are not necessarily the most relaxing, but enjoy the holiday. Enjoy any DFS you're going to be playing. If you can get to it, good luck. And we will see you all on Monday of next week. Same time, same place, 2 p.m. Eastern. Until then, see ya.